Well, as I mentioned last week, we're going to shift gears a little bit. We're just, that's not necessarily due to my choice, but that's kind of the curriculum that we're following. Kind of flip-flops back and forth throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament. I like it personally because it kind of shakes things up, gives you changes scenery from time to time where you're not just studying the same old thing over and over again. And so tonight we're going to be looking at Exodus chapters 21 through 23, if you want to be turning over there in your Bibles. And obviously we don't have time tonight to read 3 chapters in the Bible and discuss them thoroughly. So we'll simply be picking out some of the verses throughout these chapters, and just basically what I did was picked out the ones that I wanted to talk about. And I always say, since I'm the teacher, you know, you kind of have to follow my direction. I don't know if I should apologize for that or not, but that's the way that it is. So we're not going to look at everything within these chapters, but certainly they're all worthy of our consideration. But we are going to talk about some of the key points and highlights of them. Question number 1, if you look on your handout, one of the things that we're going to talk about tonight, of course, is the idea of property rights and rights of individuals and people. And obviously there's a lot of laws that deal with those types of things, even within our society today. There were a lot of laws that dealt with them under the law of Moses too. And so question number 1 is, obviously in those situations, there's going to be disputes, challenges that arise because of these things. And unfortunately, lawsuits are going to be brought from time to time. And so just thinking about our society in general, in your opinion, what are some of the pros and the cons of being able to sue somebody? What would you say are there any pros? Let's start with that.
I guess for the one suing, if he wins, there's a pro.
Okay. That's true, yeah.
I think there's certain situations you're almost forced into it, whether you want to or not.
Yeah, and if you didn't have that opportunity, and part of what I think we'll kind of address, and what the law of Moses kind of addressed, was the idea of protecting the rights of individuals and protecting the rights of your own property. I mean, if you didn't have laws that protected your rights as an individual, or laws that protected your property, then what would you have?
Anarchy.
Yeah, basically anybody could do anything they wanted to you and anything that they wanted to your stuff without any consequences. And so one of the pros that I would say that we have through the avenue of the law is you can protect yourself as an individual. You have certain rights, and you can protect your property too.
Some things, you just let go. It's not worth getting into a dispute about. And there's other things you just can't let go. Somebody buys a farm next to you, and they put a fence down the middle of your field, fence off 10 acres of yours. You can't let that go.
Yeah, and so you have certain rights as an individual, and you have the right to protect your property. And that was the same laws that people had under the law of Moses. So we have the opportunity to do that. What are some of the cons of being able to sue somebody?
It always creates bad blood.
Okay, certainly can create a dispute, harbor bad feelings toward people because of it. What else might you think?
Higher insurance rates.
Okay. I think she might work in the insurance business, but yeah, that would be one of them. Are people always, you can put some of the best plans into motion, but you're always going to have certain people who abuse and misuse, systems that are in place. And obviously that takes place within our society too. So kind of be thinking about that, because we're going to address some of those things, those ideas, the rights of personal individuals and the rights of personal property, and how God had laws in motions that protected that. So we're going to start by looking at chapter 21 here. And like I said, we're not going to read all of it, just don't have the time to do that. But a lot of it deals with how a master was to treat a servant and certain things that were to be done if he mistreated a servant. And it also addresses idea of what happens if you injure another person. What right do they have, or what did the law state? So I want to start just by reading verse 1 here in chapter 21. It says, "Now these are the judgments which you shall set before them." And obviously God is speaking to Moses here. But question number 2 on your handout is, what did God tell Moses to set before the people of Israel? Judgments. And what is a judgment?
A decision.
Okay, a decision. And whose decision was he setting forth here before the people? Yeah, this was God's decisions, wasn't it? It was God's judgments. And I know sometimes especially in the religious world, when you start talking about judgment, people sometimes get their feathers ruffled and they get a little bent out of shape because they have this idea that since the only thing that matters is divine judgment, that there's nothing that we can say or do or should do when it comes to a matter of judgment. But when you think about this idea, God laid down some divine judgments, and it was up to the people to see that those judgments were carried out and that they lived by them. And so certainly we want to do as Jesus said in John 7:24, we want to judge righteous judgment, but also want to emphasize, when we're talking about a divine judgment, and this is dealing with, again, rights of individuals and rights of personal property, protection of it. Does God know what's best in those situations? I mean, you look at these laws, and I was just thinking about a lot of them as I was going through them this week, and I thought, man, what if we had those laws in effect in our nation today? How would that change things? How would that protect people more? And how would that help to protect the property of individuals more? But these are divine judgments that God passed down to his people. And so we're going to skip some of these. Let's drop down to verse 12. And if I can, let's get somebody to read verses 12 through 14 here in Exodus 21.
He strikes a man so that he dies. However, if he does not lie in wait, but God deliver him into his hand, I will appoint for you a place where he may flee. Another one?
Yeah.
But if a man acts with premeditation against his neighbor, and kill him by treachery, you shall take him from the altar that he may die.
Okay, so you have laws, obviously, that protect individuals. And one of them, of course, is the penalty that came for committing murder. Murder is the unlawful taking of life. And what was the penalty for murder under the law of Moses? What did we just read there? Yeah, if you premeditated a murder, and of course the law allowed for instances where you might be guilty of killing somebody, but it wasn't on purpose. You didn't plan this out. And one of the examples I think that's given in the Bible is a man swinging an axe. And the axe head comes off and hits your brother in the head and kills him. Well, did you kill him? Yeah, but you're not guilty of murder because you didn't premeditate it. You didn't go out here and plan that you were going to take away his life in this way. And so the Bible describes it there as, in verse 13, God delivers him into your hand. In other words, this is just fate. This is something that God allows to happen through the natural course of events. And so you're not to be put to death in those. But every premeditated murder was to suffer the death penalty. And there were no exceptions. I mean, they had cities of refuge, of course, in the Old Testament. Remember, there were 6 cities of refuge that a person could run to if they had killed somebody. 3 were on the east side of Jordan, 3 were on the west side of Jordan. But you could find safety there. But if you were guilty of premeditated murder, God said you drag him out of the city and you put him to death. And so in all instances of that, the idea of premeditated murder, the death penalty was the punishment. So question number 3 is, why do you think God dealt so harshly with the act of murder. And not only murder, but when you look at personal injury, you know, if you cause somebody personal injury under the law of Moses, what was the law?
Usually you had to repay it, you know, in certain instances, double, triple, quadruple,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, and you have this, you know, this phrase that is pretty famous for the law of Moses, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. In other words, whatever you did, you get done back to you. And carried with it, you know, a very stiff punishment. But God dealt, you know, if you took the life of somebody or if you injured somebody, God took that seriously, didn't he? And why do you think that's the case?
You were taking his life.
Do what?
You were taking God's life.
Okay, you were taking away the life that God gave, right? You don't have, as humans, we don't have the right to take away what God has given to somebody else. And you know, one of the things that the Scripture often emphasizes is the value of human life. You know, the sanctity of human life. And so when we take away something that God has given to somebody else, then that's serious in the sight of God. And there's stiff penalties under the law of Moses that came along with that.
You know, and another purpose for punishment, I think, is deterrence. And if the penalty is so severe, then you're not gonna, you're gonna think twice before you do something, because you know the severe punishment.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because a lot of times, you know, when we think about, I think, punishment and think about, you know, the system, the penal system that exists, like in our society and others, you know, a lot of people start asking the question, well, what do we need to do? You know, what's the answer? You get so many people in prison, what's the answer to try to remedy this problem? Well, some people say, well, we've got to build more prisons, right? But one of the things you have to look at is, are the penalties that come along with these crimes stiff enough? You know, are they deterring people? That was really the point of it, like Darrell said. It was to deter people from going down that road. And if you knew as a murderer, if you killed somebody else, hey, there was no mercy, you know, it was an automatic death penalty. Do you think there'd be less murders today for that?
Yes.
Versus somebody says, well, maybe I can get 15, 20 years and get out, you know, and have the rest of my life.
Roll up to 5 years and zero.
Yeah, so you think about, again, we read these things and we think about, man, that was a tough penalty. But again, we're talking about divine judgment here. And does God know best in the situation? I think sometimes as humans, we just develop this concept, well, you know, we can do better. Or we have a better idea than what God does. Or we know better. We can enforce or come up with a better system. But there was a reason God designed the laws like he did. And there was a reason that he passed out his judgment. And so you look at the idea of murder, and you look at the idea of causing physical injury to somebody else, and it was considered very serious under the law of Moses. Let's go down to verse 15 here. Somebody read verses 15 through 17 for us.
And he that smiteth his father or his mother shall be surely put to death. And he that stealeth a man and selleth him, or if he be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death. And he that curseth his father and his mother shall surely be put to death.
Okay, so question number 4 is, based on that reading there, how did God feel about the way that parents were to be treated?
With respect and honor.
Yeah, the highest of respect, I would say, and the highest of honor. And so if a child was found cursing his parents, or if he maliciously abused his parents, what was the penalty for that? Death, wasn't it? Again, think about that. Why do you think the penalty was so harsh?
Well, because you're supposed to honor your mother and father.
Yeah, parents are an extension of God's authority, aren't they? You know, God has set up parents with authority over the home. And so when somebody maliciously abuses that authority, who are they abusing? Yeah, everything that they do, every word that is spoken against them is a word that's spoken against God. Every action that's performed against them is an action that's performed against God. And so God takes it personally whenever people attack the systems of authority that He set up. And so again, under the law of Moses, you have that reflection. So let's go down to, let's read a couple other verses here. Let's go down, somebody read verses 28 and 29 and then 32 through 36 for us, please.
If an ox gore a man or a woman that they die, then the ox shall be surely stoned, and his flesh shall not be eaten. But the owner of the ox shall be quit. But if the ox were wont to push with his horn in time past, and it had been testified to his owner, he had not kept him in, but that he had killed a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and his owner also shall be put to death. What was the other two?
32 through 36.
If the ox shall push a manservant or a maidservant, he shall give unto his master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned. And if a man shall open a pit, or if a man shall dig a pit and not cover it, and an ox or a donkey fall therein, the owner of the pit shall make it good, and give money unto the owner of them, and the dead beast shall be his. And if one man's ox hurt another, that he die, then they shall sell the live ox and divide the money of it. And the dead ox also they shall divide. Or if it be known that the ox hath used to push in times past, his owner hath not kept him in, he shall surely pay for the ox for ox, and the dead shall be his own.
Okay, so question number 5 here, it's kind of a general question, but what were some of the laws concerning ownership and responsibility?
If you have a mean bull, you better have good things.
Okay. If you owned an animal, were you responsible for that animal? Yeah, it was your responsibility, wasn't it? And so, if your animal went out here and killed another person, then the law stated your animal had to be put to death. And what was interesting is you didn't get to eat any of it either. So you didn't profit. You could say, well, if you're going to kill my ox out here, I'll at least get a meal out of it. You didn't profit from not being responsible for that animal. Now, if that hadn't been its nature, you weren't put to death. If this was like a first-time offense, nobody knew anything about it, or something happened that maybe somebody provoked the animal or something, the animal was still put to death, but the owner was not. But if you had an animal that was prone, to meanness and injuring other people, and you didn't take care of that animal responsibly, and it got out and killed somebody, then not only did the animal itself was put to death, but you were also put to death because you weren't responsible. You knew, and you didn't act responsibly.
Well, that's an example where we got law similar to their law. We have the first bite law today, and that applies to a dog or a bull or a horse or whatever. If it's never been shown to be mean or aggressive before you hurt somebody, not responsible, but if you knew it, in the case of the beware of dog signs, that's saying you know it. And if you have beware of dog sign up and you drive by somebody, you're responsible.
Yeah. And so you had this idea, you're going to be held responsible for the injuries that an animal might cause to other people. And once again, why do you think that's the case? Well, human life has value. Isn't it? It's sacred in the sight of God. And so when anybody's life is taken, it's a serious thing. There are consequences that come along with that. But one of the things that you'll see throughout the themes of the law of Moses, if you own property, you were responsible for it. If you went out and you dug a hole and you just left that hole open, and somebody comes along or their animal comes along and falls in it, are you liable? Well, sure. You dug the hole, right? So if you're going to do something, you got to be responsible for it, and that's the principles that are taught again throughout the law of Moses. So question 6 here, is God interested in conflicts being handled fairly? What would you say? Yeah, I mean, you look at these laws, that's really what it was about. When conflict arises, you know, what's the right thing to do? What's the just thing? The good judgment to carry out. And so question 7, we kind of already answered that, but in what cases might we be justified in suing a person? Well, again, I think when you're talking about protection of life, that's a law that God has put into effect. Protection of your personal property, the carrying out of justice, you know, those are things God has given us. We can't go out and personally, you know, take that matter into our own hands, but God has given government to us as one of those avenues through which we can pursue those things. So Exodus 22, anybody got any comments or questions on 21? Again, we're going to have to blaze through some of this, but it deals with, again, the possession of property and what are your responsibilities? How do you act toward other people? Somebody read the first 4 verses for us there in Exodus 22.
If a man steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, he shall restore 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. If the thief is found breaking in and he is struck so that he dies, there shall be no guilt for his bloodshed. If the sun has risen on him, there shall be guilt for his bloodshed. He should make full restitution. If he has nothing, then he shall be sold for his theft. The theft is certainly found alive in his hand, whether it is ox, donkey, or sheep, he shall restore double.
It says, okay, so question 8 on your handout is what were the laws concerning a thief? I'm just going to lay out some of the scenarios that Daryl read through there, and you tell me what the answer is. So what were the laws if a thief sells or destroys your property?
Replace whatever you stole,
And then some.
maybe 5 times, 4 times, or 2 times.
Yeah, you had to pay back either 4-fold or 5-fold. Again, if that property had already been sold or it had been disposed of or destroyed in some way. Now, think again, and we're kind of relating it to modern day, but think again if countries had laws like that for a thief. I mean, you go out and you steal a car and then, you know, this guy goes on a joyride and he just crashes the car. Well, what if you got to pay back 4-fold what you just destroyed? You think that would be a more powerful deterrent?
Only trouble is the guy that stole the car wouldn't have 4 times the amount to pay back, so.
Yeah, well, the law says you make him your slave then, until he pays it back, so. I guess you make him work until it's repaid, and until he's worked it off, he doesn't get out. That would be the solution there, but that is one of the scenarios that he addresses later on. Yes, sir?
There's still countries that if you steal, you get a hand cut off.
Right, or a finger. Yeah. So, again, you're dealing with this idea. To us, a lot of these things seem harsh, but we're talking about God's judgment here. I think God knows a little bit better than we do, you know, what's the right thing to do in these situations. So he talks about a thief that's caught after he's disposed of the goods. Well, that's kind of what Danny was talking about there. What was he supposed to do? Well, he was supposed to work until he repaid the debt. You know, and the idea there is not only work, but he becomes your indentured servant. He becomes your slave, so to speak, until he's repaid everything that he's taken away from you. So, yes, sir.
Had a standard ground law here, kind
Yeah.
Is that what, how you read that?
Yeah, I think if a thief was caught, there's a couple ways you could look at it, but if he was caught breaking in your home at night, and obviously if somebody's breaking in your home at night, you don't know the scenarios surrounding it, and you killed him, you were free. I mean, there wasn't any penalty for you doing that. Now, if the sun came up in the morning and you run after him and then you kill him, that was a little bit different. That's the idea of personal revenge or murder, I think. But if he's caught in the act, certainly that was, I think, a little bit of a different situation. And then, of course, if he was caught with the property is stolen, what was the penalty? Yeah, in that situation, you give back what you took, but you repay it again. You double back. So you had all these different situations, you know, how are people to be treated in dealing with the personal property? So question number 9 here, this is a good question, good discussion one. What kinds of conflict happen when possessions are borrowed? Anybody ever had anything borrowed from them? I think probably all of us have. You ever had something happen to that when somebody borrowed it from you? So what kind of conflicts can arise in that situation?
Break it or damage it or destroy it.
Yeah. And so what happens if it gets lost? What happens if it gets damaged? Who pays or who's responsible in that situation? And that's basically what is addressed there in verses 5 through 15. I'm not going to read it because we're running out of time fast here. But if you read about it there, when a person borrowed something, when you borrow something from somebody else, do you become responsible for that?
Should.
Yeah. So if I break it, do I say, well, I know I borrowed this from you, but it's yours, so here you go. You can fix it, right? Is that the right thing to do in that situation? Now, there is a difference between borrowing and renting, and you'll find that through verses 15. If you rent something, and basically the idea there, and it tears up, then the idea is the owner knew that to start with. That was the risk that he was taking. So it's not your responsibility to repair it in that situation. But there's certain ways that we need to react. When it comes to borrowing or taking care of one another's possessions. And again, these are Old Testament laws. I mean, these were laws that God's people lived by then, but I think they're good principles to operate by today. I mean, when you're talking about God's judgment, divine judgment in these matters, what morally is right and wrong, I don't think those things ever change. Question 11, we already did that. Did God want to protect the possessions and property of his people? Well, yeah, that's why all these laws are here. And then you read about God caring for orphans and widows in verses 22 through 24. God always there's a special place in God's heart for widows and orphans. And the reason is because many of those people in that situation are helpless. They need somebody to help them. And for a person to come along and to take advantage of them in that situation, like they need money, so I say, okay, I'll loan you some money, but it's a 50% interest you got to repay here, right? So that's kind of taking advantage of people. And so that was some of the laws that were given under the law of Moses. Over in chapter 23, there's again a conglomeration of laws that you read about there. You read about the festivals, the feasts that the children of Israel were commanded to keep. One of the things that the law addresses is the idea of bribery. And of course, nobody was to accept a bribe from somebody else, and especially those within the judicial system, within the court system. Why do you think that's the case?
That changed the outcome of what it was.
Yeah, and sometimes I think in our society we've kind of come up with some different terms. We don't call it bribery in a lot of situations, but people come up with different terms like lobbyists. And basically you're bribing somebody. You're giving somebody something because you're wanting them to side with you. And so you're trying to win over their favor or their vote or things of that nature. And it's just not a good situation, is it? Why not?
We're a capitalist society. If you throw money at something, somebody's going to do whatever it takes to get that money.
Yeah, I mean, it basically, you're operating under the presumption, number one, that everything's for sale, right? Everything can be bought at a price. Bribery conceals truth, doesn't it? It hides truth. It leads to perverted judgment. It can lead to perverted justice in the system. Bribery is an attempt to try to undermine the rights of other people or other property and promote your own. And so that was something that was thoroughly addressed in the law of Moses. And obviously within our court system, there are penalties for doing that, right? If you go into the court and not only bribing, but also lying, I guess, But if you go into the court system and you don't tell the truth, are there penalties for that?
It's called perjury.
Yeah. Some it depends on whether it's federal or state and which state it is, but it's either fines or imprisonment of some kind. But the point is, or the reason is, because the court is designed to carry out justice. And if the truth isn't told in court, how are you going to carry out justice? I mean, it's going to be impossible, isn't it? And so there should be penalties that go along with not telling the truth.
In a way, Clint, there's a lot of things that happens in the court systems today that is called plea bargaining. And that's kind of, sort of, you're charged with something. Let's say you're charged with speeding, going 50 miles an hour over the speed limit. Well, there's certain kinds of requirements that you're charged with, statutes against that, but still yet, there's a lot of times that plea bargain is done where it's looked at and said, well, why don't we just narrow this down to, you pay a big fine, and we'll plea bargain it down to defective equipment, so it doesn't affect your insurance for the next 6 months or a year or whatever it is. And like 95% of the stuff that comes to the court doesn't go to trial, it's plea bargain.
Yeah. So do you think that's a good thing or a bad thing in your opinion?
Well, it just depends on what I'm charged with.
I was gonna say, I guess it depends which seat you're in, right? But yeah, I mean, you'll see it, in murder cases too. Instead of charging somebody with first degree murder, you'll say, well, we could put you on trial, and if you're convicted, you could be put to death. But instead, would you take a plea bargain and just plead guilty to second degree murder? So you don't have to have death. But
People that were involved in it say, well, you should deal with that.
yeah, right. Yeah. We'll give you freedom if you'll tell us how it went, right? So there's a lot of that goes on, and again, it's not what God had in mind for humanity, and you can develop some problems in doing those things. We didn't read Leviticus 24 there, but you'll read about a story about a non-Israelite man who blasphemed the name of God, and didn't know what to do with him, so they put him in prison, and God revealed unto him that he was to be put to death. So they put that man to death, and you think about blaspheming the name of God. How many people today blaspheme the name of God? Take God's name in vain. I mean, that was a serious crime. God takes that personally. And I think in our society, there's so much of it today. I mean, it's just commonplace. A lot of times as Christians, I don't think we pick up on it. It's so commonplace. But how should we react to that? Well, I think probably the way we should react, our consciences have been seared by sin, the presence of it and the practice of it for so long in our society that we probably don't think of it the way that we should. But anyway, those are some of the laws, and obviously application for us today, a lot of things that we can learn from them. And Lord willing, next week we'll study some more of those. Anybody got any thoughts or comments, questions before we end tonight?